Let's continue with these journeys of Paul. But let's start. We're going to talk about people, places, events, and teachings, and follow Paul from Corinth to Ephesus and then back to Antioch and end this second missionary journey tonight. Now, he had been in Athens. Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Let's talk about Corinth just a little bit. Here it is on the map. You see the arrow in the middle, and note where Corinth is. Now you see on one side of the screen, the arrow points to Rome. On the other side, it points to Antioch. And on the bottom side, it points to Alexandria. Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria were the three largest cities of the Roman Empire. And Corinth sitting there right in the middle of all that. It's strategically located central, at least to the eastern part of the Roman Empire. You throw the western part in there over to Spain and it throws it off a little, but as far as the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Corinth is right in the middle. And it's a very busy place where people are coming and going. It's a place where if you could get the gospel to Corinth, it'll go a lot to get the gospel everywhere else, because people would be coming and going in and out of Corinth, carrying what they've learned from there to these other cities. Now let's look at it up close. This is in the region of Achaia. And down below that little part of that, I guess you'd call it the isthmus, it's the Peloponnese area. Up above is the more Achaia area, but there's a land bridge there between Corinth and Athens. I think I read is about 50 miles maybe between the two cities, but there's that little narrow land bridge. All of the commerce and travel going from the lower part of Greece to the upper part of Greece would pass through Corinth. Now, if you were on a ship and you're trying to go around, if you go around the bottom of this and try to make the circuit, it's a very dangerous journey. In fact, there was a sort of something the sailors would say if they had decided, the captain of the ship had decided to go around the cape and back up the other side, the sailors would look at each other and say, well, I hope you've got your will up to date, or I hope you've written your will, because it's very dangerous to make that. And so to escape that danger from the storms and the rocks and the treacherous waterways, because they'd have to stick close to land in those days making these journeys, well, they would go up that bay to that little 4-mile distance and sometimes drag the whole ship across that 4 miles into the other side so that they could avoid that dangerous journey. And so Corinth is not only strategically located for the travel between north and south, but also for that larger trade between east and west. Now there's the two seas coming together. Here's a photograph, and the two arrows show the two seas. This is looking from a hill, from the Corinth side of that, and look how close those two seas come together at that point. And then there's that little land bridge across there. And then the nature of Corinth. I copied this from Truth for the Today commentary. David Roper, who wrote this particular commentary, and I thought he put it very well. Athens was a small university town. Corinth was one of the commercial centers of the world. Athenians were intrigued with the intellect. The Corinthians were fascinated with the flesh. Athenians claimed to search for the truth. Corinthians unashamedly pursued pleasure. Now put yourself in Paul's shoes. He had come over into Macedonia following that vision that Christ had sent him. And he was shamefully entreated at Thessalonica. Yeah, shamefully entreated at Thessalonica, at Philippi. Shamefully entreated at Philippi. And then he comes to Thessalonica and he had to leave by night to escape the the plots that were against him. He goes to Berea, and they'd come down from Thessalonica and stirred up the same trouble, and he had to flee from Berea. He goes into Athens, and there at Athens, he is pretty much ignored by the intellectuals. And now he comes to Corinth. There's a much larger city known for its wickedness. And Paul has become a little bit unnerved here. He says in 1 Corinthians 2 in verse 3, when he writes a letter to them about his coming to them, he says, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And that word for weakness could refer to physical weakness. He may have been sick when he got there. In fact, it's to the Corinthians in the second letter that he writes about that thorn in the flesh that he had. So that may have been bothering him when he came to Corinth. So here he is, rejected, discouraged, maybe physically sick, and he's somewhat unnerved coming into this place. And he comes in and he doesn't even have the means to take care of himself. And so he meets with a certain Jew named Aquila and Priscilla, and they are tent makers. We'll see down in verse 3. But there's a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. Now notice these places for the Bible Bowl, okay? Pontus, lately come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. There's two things going to occur here that we find in secular history that overlap with the account in Acts that zero us in on a date about the year when these things are taking place. And one is the time when the Jews are expelled from Rome. Now I want you to remember that Pontus, let's look at it, Pontus. Priscilla and Aquila had come from Pontus. That's the end of that orange arrow out there, up by the Black Sea. In fact, in the old legends of the Greeks and the Romans, you've heard about the Amazons, maybe. That's not something in South America. The Amazons was that army of women warriors, and they were from Pontus, up here about this part of the Dead Sea. In the legends, they were anyway. So they'd come from Pontus, and somehow they had gotten to Rome, and now they'd been expelled from Rome, and Aquila and Priscilla have come to Corinth. Now, it was in AD 49. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us there was a disturbance among the Jews about one called Christus that caused them to be expelled from Rome. So I put the word Christus up here, and look how close that looks to Christus. And many think this might have been a disturbance about Jesus Christ. There were Jews from Rome on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem. And they would have carried that gospel back to Rome, and we don't know how the church at Rome began. There's no account of that. But you know how the Jews were in opposition to the preaching of Christ everywhere Paul went. That could have been what was behind this disturbance that caused those Jews to be expelled from Rome. And in those days, those Romans considered Christians to be a sect of the Jews. And so just tell the Jews to leave. And that expulsion from a city, that was a common thing in those days, to be expelled. It doesn't mean you had to stay away, but you had to leave for a certain amount of time before you could return. And so they were expelled from Rome. The Jews said, you all just have to leave Rome. You're causing too much trouble. And it was at that time that Aquila and Priscilla come to Corinth. So that's AD 49, and they were recently come to Corinth, and so that begins to zero us in on a date. There's another episode we're going to look at here. Well, they were the same craft. He abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. Now, some say, well, that might mean leather workers. Well, it might. But with all the people coming and going in Corinth, and the agora, and also there were the games. It was like the Olympics that occurred every 2 years in Corinth. People would come, and there was a great demand for tents. And these tents didn't last long when they had these tents. And so Paul could have a good occupation repairing and producing and sewing together these tents. And that's what Aquila and Priscilla were doing. Now, I want you to remember, Aquila and Priscilla, we're going to read about them in Corinth and in Ephesus and in Rome. Every time we read about them, the church is meeting in their house. They sound like a couple of some means, but perhaps because they've been sent away from Rome, means were not available to them or reduced, and say they've fallen back into this trade of tent making, and that's what Paul had done when he was with them. Well, while he's there, Silas and Timotheus come from Macedonia. The orange arrow. I'm not going to go into this, but we can look at the evidence. It sounds like Silas came down from Philippi, and Timothy came down from Thessalonica. And together they joined Paul there at Corinth. And when Paul goes into the synagogues, here's what he does. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. He's persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And then Paul was pressed in the spirit. Here his friends are showing up, and he just feels compelled. I've got to preach that Jesus is the Christ. And so he testifies to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Note those words. Reasoned, persuaded, testified. He had a testimony. Well, Jesus had appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And we see that coming up in Paul's preaching. And so from the scriptures, he would reason. He would persuade. He would address their intelligence and get them to think this through. Not that was a response of an emotion that they would have, but of an understanding they would have by the thing he's teaching them. Well, there were those that opposed themselves and blasphemed. To blaspheme means to speak against. And they were speaking against what Paul was preaching. And in so doing, they opposed themselves. That's what happened when you speak against the gospel. The one you're most hurting is yourself. You're opposing yourself to speak against the gospel. Well, he shook his raiment and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm clean. I've done what I can do. Shaking the raiment, just shaking the raiment. That'd be like shaking the dust off your feet like he'd done in Antioch at Pisidia. And then this idea of your blood be on your own heads. That goes back to the prophet Ezekiel. It says if a watchman sees a danger and warns the city, and the city doesn't respond to the warning of the watchman, their blood's on their own heads. They'd heard, they had the chance, and they rejected it. And so that's what Paul is saying here. Your blood be on your own heads. I've tried to teach you, and you're speaking against it. You're blaspheming. You're opposing yourself. And now I'm going to preach to the Gentiles. So he departed thence, and he went next door. He said he entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshiped God, which is like Cornelius. It's a Gentile that has not become a Jew, but they're wanting to worship the God of the Jews. So here's Justus, one that worshiped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. He was right next door. And so Paul's leaving the Jews, and Justus, you can just preach right from my house. I'm right next door. Well, then there we read about Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue. Well, he believed on the Lord with all his house. I mean, he was like the head man over there. And he goes over with Paul over to the house of justice. And his house goes with him. And then notice this. Many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. There's the pattern that you see repeated through the book of Acts. Hearing, believed, and baptized. And Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians 1, 14 through 16. I thank God I baptized none of you but Crispus. Well, that's whose house he was in, next door. Was the one that was the ruler of the synagogue. Gaius, some think Gaius may be the same man as Justus. That was whose house was next door. May not have been, may have been a different person. But there's Crispus mentioned, who'd believed in the Lord with all his house. And Paul had baptized him, like many of the Corinthians. He said, lest I say I'd baptized in my own name, I baptize also the household of Stephanas. Besides, I know not whether I baptized any other. So he's baptizing people into Christ in their meeting in the house that was right next door to the synagogue. Well, the Lord came to Paul in a vision at night. Paul must have been worried about what he was up against because the Lord encourages him. He says, be not afraid, but speak. Hold not thy peace, for I am with thee. No man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. That promise, no man will set upon thee to hurt thee. You see, the opposition's going to be raised against Paul, and they're going to try to hurt him, but it's not going to happen, as we'll see in just a moment. And so Paul continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. He's staying at Corinth for an extended period of time, and out of that big wicked city, he's gathering those that are seeking after the Lord and want to be at one with him. And he's finding them there. Now, when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia. Now, Achaia is all of Greece. This was a high, important position to be the deputy of Achaia. And sure enough, in the old records of old Rome, we read about Gallio. And he became the deputy of Achaia in A.D. 50. So we've got the date of A.D. 49 and the date of A.D. 50. And both of those dates coincide with the time that Paul is at Corinth. And that's one of those places that we kind of serve as a benchmark when we're dating things in the New Testament, going back and forth from this date, that we can zero in within 1 year of when these things took place. Well, the Jews made an insurrection with one accord against Paul and besought him to the judgment seat. And the trial that they're making on him, they say, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Well, what law? Roman law? Jewish law? What law are we talking about? And this is just typical what's going to happen with Gallio and how he handles this. It matches the reputation that we have of him from historical accounts outside the scriptures. But I want you to notice right here, they brought Paul before the judgment seat. You know, I guess if a big tornado came through here, or long destruction and destroyed McMinnville, someday some archaeologist might come to town and think, well, look, this is where the city hall was. This is where court was held. And they could identify that place in town from the ruins. And they have identified the judgment seat of old Corinth. Now, here's a picture of it. It's that elevated platform. And that pillar that upper arrow points to is the very spot where the judge would sit. And that other pillar that is pointing to the ground there below it, that smaller pillar, is the place where the person would stand that was being accused. You could go to Corinth today and see the very place Gallio would have sat and the very place Paul would have stood when he was on trial in Roman Corinth. Well, Paul was about to open his mouth. Paul's going to give a defense, but Gallio, he sizes this thing up quick, and that's one of the things about him. He saw through things and used good judgment and used a level head and cut right to the end. He didn't let things get out of hand. Gallio was a very excellent ruler in old Rome, according to those records, and you see it here. Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lawlessness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. In other words, I'd put up with you of a case like that. He said, but if it's a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it. I'll be no judge in such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. He saw right away, you don't have any standing in this court. This is not a matter. I'm here for Roman law and Roman things and civil matters. And here you've got a religious dispute. And you're bringing that before me in my court. Get them out of this. Get them out of here. We're not going to have this trial here over that matter. And that just shows the kind of man that Gallio was. And then he let them handle it. You take care of that yourself. Well, here's what happened. All the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue. Was he the one that replaced Crispus, maybe? That after Crispus had become a Christian? Now Sosthenes, there's a little question here about what goes on. But the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of these things. I guess he thought if they don't have any more sense than to bring that kind of stuff, let them just beat him up out there. And so this really turned on the Jews, didn't it? Well, Paul tarried there yet a good while, and then took leave of the brethren and sailed thence to Syria. And that's Antioch of Syria, where he would have begun. And with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. Now here's something that we just got to know that that's what it says. And if you want a better understanding of what this vow was and why he had to shave his head, well, it doesn't go into detail describing that. There's an Old Testament vow you can take, the Nazarite vow. And you could take a lifetime Nazarite vow like Samson did, be under that for a lifetime. But there was temporary Nazarite vows, maybe for so many months, I'm not going to shave my head. And then at the end, under the Nazarite vow, you were supposed to go to the temple in Jerusalem and shave your head there, or go to the priest there to shave your head. Well, that's not what Paul did. He's over here at Cenchrea. It may have been something like that. I know sometime somebody will say, if we raise this much funds, I'll shave my head. And then they shave their head for all the students to laugh at him, while he shaves his head. But this was taken more serious than that. Some vow he made, it required him to shave his head. He did so at Cenchrea. That is the seaport town of Corinth on the eastern side of the city. And so that's where Paul would have left from to go back to Syria. He shaved his head and he came to Ephesus. That's the first stop. Well, he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. That'd be Aquila and Priscilla. There in Ephesus, Paul leaves them in town. He goes wherever that synagogue is, and he's preaching to the Jews there at Ephesus. And they desired him to tarry a longer time with them, but he consented not. He bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh at Jerusalem. Now, what feast was that? and we could just guess at this. There were 7 feasts that the Jews would keep. The 3 most important ones was Pentecost and the Passover, and then over in the fall, the Atonement. And it could have been, people think generally, well, this may have been a Passover feast he was trying to make. And we don't know if he got there in time or not. But there was some feast at Jerusalem he was trying to get to. And he says, I'll return to you again if God will. That's how we ought to speak of things, if God will. Paul is in Asia. Now think back. You remember when he was coming out of Galatia? And he wanted to go into Asia? And the Spirit bade him not to go. So he said, well, I'll go into Bithynia. And the Lord said, no, don't go there either. Keep going. So he went to Troas and got the call to go into Macedonia. It was God's will that I come to Asia. That's where I wanted to go. With the ship carrying him back to Syria, stopped at Ephesus. So he preached to the Jews, if God's will, I will return. But he's placing that on God's will. Well, God won't him there yet. Well, he sailed from Ephesus, and then Acts 18:22, we're going to bring this to a close. When he landed at Caesarea, that's that harbor town that Herod had built on the Mediterranean Sea, not Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea Maritima. And so he comes into that port, and he went up and saluted the church. Was it the church at Caesarea? Or was it the church at Jerusalem? He was wanting to get to Jerusalem. And he went up and addressed the church. And that's how you talk about going to Jerusalem, going up. So Luke's a little bit ambiguous here about how you put this together. The general idea, though, is that Paul came to Caesarea. He went up to Jerusalem. We don't know if he got there in time for the feast or not. But he saluted the church and then went down from Jerusalem to Antioch, going north. But you always go down from Jerusalem. You go up to Jerusalem and down to Jerusalem, regardless of the compass points from which you're traveling. And so that's where his travels would have taken him. From Corinth, Caesarea, the little seaport town, and then to Ephesus, and then across the sea to Caesarea, up to Jerusalem, and down to Antioch, ending his second missionary journey. Paul would write, 3 times was I shipwrecked. A night and the day I spent in the deep. And we don't know when that was, but with all the sea travel involved in this, it could have been during some of this time that Paul had those treacherous journeys to make. But he's come to Antioch, and actually the second missionary journey begins the second missionary journey ends in the middle of that verse. Acts chapter 18 and verse 22. And the third missionary journey begins at the end of this verse. So you got the beginning of the verse when the second journey ends, and the end of the verse where the third journey is going to begin. But we're going to stop here at the end of that second journey. Look at the people we've talked about. A lot of names here. See if you can remember who they were. Paul, Aquila, Priscilla, Claudius, Silas, Timotheus, Jesus, Justus, God, Crispus, Gallio, Sosthenes. Can you attach an identity to those names? Look at these places. What happened in these places? Athens, Corinth, Pontus, Italy, Rome, Achaia, Cenchrea, Ephesus, Syria, Caesarea, Jerusalem, Antioch. 12 names, 12 places. Let's talk about some things we learn. Number one, cities like Corinth need the gospel. Sometimes you think, oh, that's so awful. That'd be such a hard place. That'd be bad work over there. Those are the people who need the gospel. And sometimes those that are the furthest in sin are the most receptive to the gospel. And so we need to have our spirit moved within us to get the gospel to these places where it's most desperately needed. Paul reasoned, persuaded, and testified that Jesus was the Christ. That was the method of his preaching, as we see over and over in the book of Acts. That's the way Paul did his work. To reject the gospel is to oppose ourselves. The one you're hurting the most is your own self. But then this last point, and this will go to our invitation tonight, many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Do you want to get into a deep theological discussion? It's not necessary. You see what they did. They heard, they believed, they were baptized. You don't have to have a theological degree to understand that. And that's what people need to do now. Don't oppose yourself. Hear, believe, and be baptized. That's the pattern that we see over and over and over in the book of Acts. And that's what we need to do today. And if any tonight need to respond to the gospel by doing that very thing, then you can do it while we sing this invitation song.